Great. So hopefully you can hear me. So my name's Graham, and I work for a company called Scott Logic. So we're a software development consultancy, and that's as much as I'm going to say about that. So shameless plug aside. So I'm head of UX design at this consultancy. And in a long distant past, I was a developer, but I shifted. And one of the reasons I shifted is because I never got rid of my inner 4-year-old. I couldn't stop asking this question about, well, practically anything, to be honest. And one of the things I was asking this question about, this why, recently was fairly obvious, but why are desktop apps so big? Why is it, and I'm going to pick on Outlook quite a lot here, but this applies to pretty much every desktop application ever. Why is email trying to take over most of my screen? It's huge. Why can't I make it a lot smaller? Just to prove to you, I can't make it any narrower than that. That's as small as the email let me go. But if I look at my mobile version of that, so my smartphone, for those of you who don't believe me, that is my smartphone being mirrored there. I don't want to delete my Anchorman quotes. That's small. Why can't I have that on my desktop? If you know Outlook intimately, and I really hope you don't, you might know that you could be a designer and you could do that. So if you go into the menus here, I could sort of get rid of that, and I could get rid of that, and I could get rid of that, and now I've sort of got something a little bit like what I got on my mobile phone, but for some reason, it still won't let it be any smaller. Why not? I mean, if you look at a typical website these days, and this is one we built earlier this year with Next Group, it kind of does this, right? So this infinity loop thing, it's a sort of filtering mechanism, and it's whizzy and lovely. But if I shrink this right down, then it's now narrower. It still works. It looks completely different. It's exactly the same functionality, but presented in a completely different way that works in this small little window. It's sort of done this magic for me rather than make me be a designer. Let's take a look at Outlook and their web app. It doesn't do that at all. It gives me scroll bars, the developer's solution to all problems. Why can't our applications on the desktop do some of this sort of this magic for us? I love auto magic. Now, the facetious answer as to why it can't do auto magic is that Elon Musk only started trying to interface with our brain earlier this year. He hasn't quite cracked it yet, but maybe by next year we'll be able to get there. A more realistic answer is that the typical desktop technologies that we've historically used, like these ones, just don't really make this very easy. You can do it. It takes a lot of time and effort, but it's pretty painful. And when I'm talking about this, I mean, I'm not just talking about making things bigger and smaller, right? It's something actually more fundamental than that. What we're talking about is context here. It's reacting to the context. It's reacting to how I'm using it or what I'm trying to do with it. And to bring that to life, take this example. So here's 3 different people. Potentially they're all looking at their order book. But the context is different, right? The guy on the top there, he's maybe commuting home, and he's just checking his order book to make sure that he's not left anything active that he really shouldn't have. It's very different from maybe his manager who's taking a look at that month's activities for the whole team. Again, it's still just looking at an order book, but he's in his quiet little office, he's got time to think about it. And that's different again from the trader on the trading floor who's dealing with all the noise around him and all the distractions, and the market's going mental. He's still looking at his order book, but he's actually in work mode at that point. The same basic activity of I just want to check my order book, but it's completely different because of the different contexts. And that's when this smaller, bigger thing is actually this. It's about this context, a much bigger beast. And the way we try and tackle that problem of context is a technique called responsive design. It's quite a cryptic term. It pretty much means we'd like to respond to the context of use, for those of you who couldn't work that one out. And it's currently very much conflated with this idea of just making things bigger and smaller, but it is something more fundamental than that. And just to give you an example, and this is an app we built quite a few years ago now. This is a private equity analysis tool. And if you look at the widget down the bottom that says totals, that has a couple of big numbers peeking out, the context here is if I move this around and I put it somewhere where there's more space for it, it gives me a lot more detail on that analysis. If I drill down into it, it gives me loads more. So the context is I'm focusing in on that specific analysis, and it's giving me more and more content back as I do that. So the reason I particularly like HTML is because it's sort of got this idea of responsive design baked in as a first-class citizen, unlike pretty much every other technology. it has it in many, many different ways, but the way most people think of it is it has this thing called media queries. I'm going to get a little bit technical, but not too technical. But media queries, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, shame on you, but it's a way of, I guess, effectively conditionally styling or laying out based on the context of use. That's the broader concept. The reality right now is that it's predominantly down to how big is my window or what way is it orientated. But there are specs for more I say deeper insight into context. So there's specs coming along for being able to do a media query about the light level, or some of the other ones are really bonkers. I'm not going to go into those. But all these other sort of things where you're starting to say, well, where and how is this being used? So should I invert the colors because we're suddenly in sort of a night mode type of thing? We could do that with a media query in some of the development browsers. But the beauty here is that it's not just about the tech, right? There's a mindset that goes along with it about doing responsive design, just that we should do it. And that's baked into HTML5 development as well. And these containers that we're talking about tonight, OpenFin, Electron, all these kinds of things, bring that technology down onto the desktop. So if we're bringing the technology, we should probably take the mindset as well. And so I wanted to show you an example of this kind of thing. This is a demo fake app, but it's based on something I am working on at the moment with a real client. So imagine this is an FX trading app, fairly simple one, and at the top there we've got our trade ticket, and then a blotter. Every application is mostly blotters, so I thought I'd throw a big one in there. And it's great, it's nice and big, but imagine that I'm not someone who really wants to take up most of my screen with this, because I don't really do FX trading that much. Maybe I'm a finance officer in some multinational corporation that's got nothing to do with finance. I just occasionally need to book in some trades just to look after my cash flow in the business. So maybe I don't want this to take up the whole screen because I prefer to have a massive spreadsheet. So as I squeeze this down, what I've done as the designer and developer of this tool is I've decided that as you squeeze this down, which columns you care about in that blotter. So they start to disappear as you don't really need them. You get to this point where it drops down, and actually it's now sort of become like a Twitter feed rather than a table, because if you make it this small, well, why would I be doing all the sort of the analytical things that a table might let you do? Let me shrink it right down. But I took this even further, and as I shrink this up, and you see lots of things changing and moving around here, when I make it small enough, I've decided that you don't care about the blotter anymore. Or that's not a first-class citizen. Why would I care about it? If I just want to be able to book a trade, now I've got this tiny little widget. And look how much of the screen I can use for the rest of the stuff. That's my context, right, is I care about everything else and maybe just a bit of FX booking. So that's a slightly artificial example, but you saw lots and lots of different things moving on there independently, lots of little decisions, design decisions that have been implemented there. And anyone who's used media queries will know that they're a bit of a pig. They look at this context of the window rather than anything else. So if I've got lots of components, then all the media queries are looking at the size of the window rather than component, and it gets messy, and you end up with code that is not modular at all. And I was going to show you some of this code, but I thought this summarized it better because I don't want to hurt anyone's eyes. But as I was looking through this and researching it, there's a spec in development for this thing called container queries. And it's the idea of taking media queries, but being able to apply them to any individual div, any element in our DOM. And that started to let me sort of modularize some of this consideration. So the context could suddenly be a much smaller context. So when I'm building a tiny part of the component, so just the trade ticket, I can think about the big context or the small context. That's up to me as the designer and the developer. But of course, this is a web spec, and as is the case with most web specs, it's a work in progress and no browser supports it and yada, yada, yada. But don't let that put you off, because as with most work in progress specs in the HTML5 world, there's libraries and shims for it in practically every framework you could want to use. So you can use container queries. That demo I showed you is using container queries in a way in React that works really quite nicely. And then you end up with these nice contained reusable components, and they don't have to be a window. They can be something much smaller than that, and I can take my trade ticket and I can drop it into another application, and it can still think in terms of trade ticket rather than thinking in terms of the context the application it's in, potentially. That's up to me as the designer. But I'm getting really detailed and really technical here, and I want to zoom back out to the thing that matters here, right? The thing that matters is that we should be focusing on users' intent, the thing they want to achieve, their workflow, as we were talking about earlier. We're building tools to help them execute on that intent. We shouldn't have them thinking about that tool. They aren't a designer. They shouldn't be thinking, well, I need to configure this and do this and move my windows around and do that. We should try to bake in that auto magic. We should be doing all this hard work for them so that when Elon Musk nails the whole brain interface thing, the technology is going to be able to react and work with it straight away. And this beauty with this HTML5, this whole mindset is baked into it. The technology is baked into it. And OpenFin and all these other containers are bringing that down onto the desktop. And we should take that with us. We shouldn't sit there and create old school desktop applications with new technologies just because that's the way we've always done it. We should take the good bits from the web with us. And that way, all of us together can actually move towards something I call a responsive desktop. Thank you very much.